On this channel, $1 Million Made Easy, we love to run numbers for people. What we do is look at what the S&P 500 has done over the last 100 years and project ahead what it might do in the future. I got a request for somebody. He said he's 48 years old. He realizes he's getting started late. He has $3,000 saved up and he can save $500 a month. He wants to know where he might be at age 68, which would be 20 years later. Now, what we do on this channel is run numbers, but I'm really hesitant to run less than like 30 years. If you look in column E of this Google Sheet spreadsheet, I got the numbers using different years. What we're going to use the amounts that he said, 3,000. He has 3,000. He's putting $500 a month in. After 20 years, the reason I have that in red is because I'm really hesitant in such a short period of time. And over in columns H to K, we show you the two different decades we're talking about. When you're only looking at 20 years, you can have a huge variance. And I'm really hesitant, again, to run it for less than that. I love to run it for at least 30 years or more. And that's why I have 30 years in gold, then light blue is 35, and so on. But we're going to be looking at the 20-year column because that's where he's at. He's 48 years old, so we got to take him where he's at. And I'm just going to use several different years to look at, to show you the wide variance you could have. Is he going to be able to make it $1 million to $1 million? Probably not. Well, let's see what he can reach. If we have numbers like 1970, if the next 20 years were like 1970, columns H through K show you there was 4 down years in those 2 decades. You can see them there in red. And if you look at the column after 20 years in the red there, you would have had 590,616. Again, these are approximations. Let's continue. How about 1980? 1980 would have been an amazing 2 decades. There would only been 2 down years. You see them in the red there in columns H through K. What would you end up with? Look at that, 1,012,000. Is that unusual? Yes, highly unusual. Have 2 decades like that in a row. Let's move on. How about 1990? 1990, you have the good 1990s decade, but you had the horrible 2000 decade. What'd you end up with? What would you have ended up with? 236,000. Let's continue on. The year 2000. The 2000 decade, you would have been horrible, but the next decade, the 20 teens, would have been great. What would you end up with? Again, in the 20-year column, in the red, 352,000. Let's move on. The very last 20 years, you would have had 3 down years in the last 2 decades. What would you end up with? 428,000. Now, you also mentioned about you could possibly maybe put in a let's go ahead and look at 1989. That's the absolute worst case scenario. Again, we're talking about in the last 50, 60 years. If we looked at the Depression years, it would actually have been worse. But look at you had the good decades of the 90s, but you had the horrible decades of the 2000s in column J and K. In fact, you ended up with 2008 going down 37%. What would you end up with after 20 years? $209,000. Let's go ahead and do one more thing. Let's inflate that $500 by 3% each year. In other words, $500 the first year, and then $515 the next year, so on. You're putting a little bit more money. Let's go ahead and go through the numbers. In 1989, you would have had 251,000, as opposed to if you wouldn't increase that by 3%, you can see it was 209,000. So that 3% a year increased it by 42,000. Let's continue on here. Let's look at $600 a month with that same 3% inflation. Again, the worst case scenario in 1989, you have 298,000, as opposed to if you just had $500 with no inflation, it'd be 209,000. So you made a difference of $90,000. Again, we're looking at the worst case scenario, but I want to give them the range. Let's go and look at the year 2000. Would add the returns were like the year 2000. You'd have the down decade of the 2000s, but you have the positive decades of the 20 teens, and you'd end up with 528,000. Let's go ahead and do the absolute last 20 years. With 3 down years, you did have the one in 2008, but you would have 623,000. But see, you can see a huge range here as you go through here. Let's continue with a little bit more here. Again, we looked at the worst case scenario, 298,000 in 1989. Let's go ahead and increase that to 700, because they did mention 200 a month occasionally. I'm just going to give them the numbers for if you could do that, $200 a month on top of the 500, which is what he started with. In other words, $700 a month, increasing that by 3% a year. In the worst case scenario, you had $345,000. Remember, his initial was $500 a month with no inflation. That was $209. So if he could increase that monthly amount to by $200 and inflate it by 3%, he'd have $345,000. Again, it all depends on what is going on in columns H through K. Let's go a little bit farther here. 2004, which would be the last 20 years, with the 3 down years in the 2 decades. Look at the amount you would have, $724,000. But this is why I don't like to run it for just 20 years, because it's such a huge variance. And we've gone from 209,000 up to, if you did the numbers like the 80s and 90s, over $1 million. Here you have 724,000. We're all over the ballpark. Let's go one more time through the 1970. What would you have in this scenario? You'd have 992,000. Again, this is beginning with the 3,000 and putting in $700 a month, increasing that by 3% a year. 1980, this would be the absolute best. Again, the 2 best decades back to back, with only 2 down years in those 2 decades. You'd have $1.6 million. Do you see the variance we're talking about here? Let's pretty much stop there. Hopefully, I made some sense in this video that if you're just looking at 20 years, it's really problematic. But if you could go out there 30, 35, 40 years, you can see the numbers just get huge. You don't even have to have those kind of numbers, $700 a month. You can get down to like $300 a month. But again, we're talking about somebody that's already 48, and this is where he's at. So I wanted to run the numbers for him. That's what we do in this channel. We run numbers for people. It's called $1 Million Made Easy. Please consider subscribing. Please tell your friends about this channel. Let them know that there's a channel out there that will run numbers for them. Preferably, if you have at least 25 years. That's why I have it in purple there. And preferably you have 30, 35, or 40 years. And you can see the amounts just are amazing with just small amounts. But that's what we do on this channel, run numbers. Please like the video, and thanks for watching.